The echoing crack of flesh meeting flesh silenced the murmurs in the courtroom. A sound so stark and unexpected it ripped through the hushed tension like a physical blow. Tiffany, her face still stinging from the brutal smack delivered by Officer Miller, felt a hot, unfamiliar rage ignite within her. It wasn't just the pain. It was the sheer indignity of it, the public humiliation in a place that was supposed to represent justice. Her vision blurred for a split second, not from tears, but from the sudden, overwhelming urge to lash out. Before anyone, even Miller, who stood with a smug smirk playing on his lips, could react, Tiffany moved. It was an instinct, a primal defiance. Her hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the judge's bench, and with a surprising surge of strength, she vaulted over the polished wood barrier. Gasps erupted as she landed awkwardly, but firmly, in the plush, high-backed chair, its rich leather still warm from the judge who had just stormed out in a fit of pique. The gavel lay on the stand, an almost comical prop beside her trembling hand. Silence descended once more, heavier this time, thick with disbelief and a chilling sense of foreboding. The entire courtroom, from the jury box to the prosecution table, was frozen, staring at the sight of a young black woman, just slapped by a cop, now occupying the most powerful seat in the room. What in the world was happening? Just a few hours earlier, the morning sun had painted Tiffany's small apartment in Brooklyn with soft, hopeful light. Tiffany, a vibrant 28-year-old with dreams bigger than her modest surroundings, was meticulously preparing for what she hoped would be a turning point in her life. Today was the day she would finally present her case in small claims court against Glamour Gowns, a popular online boutique that had, in her opinion, swindled her out of a significant sum of money. Tiffany wasn't just any young woman. She was a budding fashion designer with an eye for detail and a fierce passion for ethical business practices. She'd spent the last 2 years pouring her heart, soul, and every spare dollar into her own online store, Threads of Truth, which specialized in sustainable and custom-made apparel. Her reputation was everything, built on honesty and quality. This lawsuit wasn't just about the money, though the $2,500 she was seeking was a considerable sum for her. It was about principle. The conflict with Glamour Gowns began innocently enough. Tiffany had ordered a batch of fabrics from them, advertised as organic silk from Italy, to fulfill several high-end custom dress orders for Threads of Truth. The pictures on Glamour Gowns' website were stunning, promising luxurious textiles. When the shipment arrived, however, Tiffany's heart sank. The fabric was rough, clearly synthetic, and reeked of cheap dyes. It was a far cry from the promised Italian silk. She immediately contacted Glamour Gowns, but her polite inquiries were met with dismissive replies, then outright hostility. They refused a refund, claimed their product was exactly as advertised, and even suggested she was trying to pull a scam. Tiffany, usually mild-mannered, felt a spark of indignation. This wasn't just bad business. It was a lie, and it threatened her own budding reputation. If she delivered dresses made from this shoddy material, her customers would be disappointed, and Threads of Truth, her life's ambition, would suffer. She tried everything: emails, phone calls, even a strongly worded letter from a pro bono legal aid clinic. Nothing worked. Glamour Gowns was a bigger fish with what seemed like an army of lawyers, or at least a very aggressive legal team, designed to scare off small claims. But Tiffany wasn't easily scared. She had spent countless nights researching consumer law, gathering evidence, and meticulously documenting every interaction. She had samples of the fake fabric, screenshots of the website's deceptive descriptions, and even sworn affidavits from 2 of her frustrated customers who had almost canceled their orders. Her best friend, Maria, a no-nonsense paralegal student with a penchant for brightly colored hair and an unshakable loyalty, had been her rock. "Tiff, you got this," Maria had said last night, as they reviewed Tiffany's meticulously organized binder. "Your evidence is solid. Their practices are shady. The judge will see it." "I hope so," Tiffany had replied, her stomach a flutter of nerves and determination. "It's not just about the money, you know? It's about standing up for what's right. If I let them get away with this, what does that say about me?" This morning, Tiffany dressed carefully in a smart, navy blue pantsuit, a crisp white blouse, and a pair of sensible, yet stylish, heels. She wanted to look professional, serious, and ready to fight for her truth. Her natural hair, usually styled in intricate braids, was pulled back into a sleek, low bun, framing her intelligent eyes. She took a deep breath, grabbed her binder, and headed out, a potent mix of hope and anxiety swirling within her. The courthouse, a grand old building with imposing stone columns, felt intimidating. Inside, the hallways buzzed with people, lawyers in expensive suits, defendants looking nervous, and families waiting anxiously. Tiffany found the correct courtroom, number 3B, and took a seat on a polished wooden bench, clutching her binder like a shield. Her case, Tiffany Jones versus Glamour Gowns LLC, was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. As the clock ticked past, the courtroom slowly filled. The representative for Glamour Gowns arrived, a man in a pinstripe suit named Mr. Harrison, accompanied by a younger, sharp-looking lawyer, Ms. Albright. They exuded an air of corporate confidence, barely glancing at Tiffany. They laughed quietly, whispered, and seemed utterly unconcerned, which only fueled Tiffany's resolve. Judge Sterling, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun, entered precisely at 10:30 a.m. Everyone rose. Her voice, when she spoke, was gravelly and authoritative. She ran through a few minor cases, dismissing one with a wave of her hand and postponing another due to missing paperwork. Tiffany watched, taking mental notes, trying to gauge the judge's temperament. Judge Sterling seemed fair, but no nonsense, preferring clear facts over emotional appeals. This suited Tiffany just fine. When her case was finally called, Tiffany felt a rush of adrenaline. She walked to the plaintiff's table, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Mr. Harrison and Ms. Albright took their seats opposite her, their expressions still unreadable. Tiffany presented her case with clarity and precision, laying out her evidence point by point. She showed the judge the pictures from Glamour Gowns' website, then held up a sample of the actual fabric she received, letting the judge feel its rough texture. She presented the emails, the shipping manifests, and the affidavits from her customers. She spoke eloquently about the impact this fraud had on her small business and her reputation. "Your Honor," Tiffany concluded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I am not just asking for my money back. I am asking for justice, for truth in advertising, for the protection of small businesses like mine against predatory practices." Judge Sterling listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp, concise questions. She seemed to be following Tiffany's arguments closely, her gaze unwavering. Tiffany felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, finally, someone would listen. Then it was Glamour Gowns' turn. Ms. Albright, with a smooth, practiced delivery, began to dismantle Tiffany's case. She argued that the fabric description was subjective, that organic silk was a marketing term, not a scientific classification. She claimed that Tiffany had likely mishandled the fabric, or was simply trying to get free materials. She even suggested that Threads of Truth was a failing business, trying to recoup losses through frivolous lawsuits. "Your Honor," Ms. Albright said, her voice dripping with disdain, "Ms. Jones's allegations are baseless. She is an amateur, attempting to exploit the court system. We have provided a product consistent with our advertising. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to slander our reputable business." The words stung. Tiffany's cheeks flushed, but she held her tongue, remembering Maria's advice. Let them talk. The truth will out. As the arguments continued, a subtle shift occurred in the courtroom's atmosphere. Officer Miller, a burly police officer known for his aggressive demeanor and short temper, who had been observing from the back, began to subtly interject with coughs and audible sighs whenever Tiffany spoke. He wasn't officially part of the case, but he seemed to have a vested interest in Glamour Gowns, or at least a personal vendetta against Tiffany. Tiffany had seen him before, lurking around court proceedings, often exchanging knowing glances with Ms. Albright and Mr. Harrison. There were rumors he was related to one of the Glamour Gowns executives, or perhaps simply a friend of the firm, brought in to observe and intimidate. Judge Sterling, usually unflappable, seemed increasingly annoyed by the disruptions. "Officer Miller," she warned once, her voice sharp. "This is a courtroom. Please maintain decorum." Miller grumbled an apology, but his eyes, when they met Tiffany's, held a chilling glint of malice. Tiffany tried to ignore him, focusing on the judge, but his presence was a heavy, unsettling weight. The court broke for a short recess. Tiffany used the time to collect her thoughts, her hands still trembling slightly. She felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Judge Sterling's expression had become harder to read during Ms. Albright's closing arguments. Had her hope been misplaced? When court resumed, Judge Sterling leaned forward. "I have heard both sides," she began, her gaze sweeping between Tiffany and the glamour gowns team. "Ms. Jones has presented compelling evidence regarding the discrepancy between the advertised product and what she received. However, Ms. Albright has raised points about subjective interpretation of marketing terms." Tiffany's heart pounded. This was it, the verdict. "Given the complexities," Judge Sterling continued, "and the he-said-she-said nature of some of the claims, I find myself requiring more time to deliberate. I will issue a written judgment by the end of the week." A collective sigh, mostly from the glamour gowns table, swept through the room. Tiffany felt a wave of disappointment. A delay? She had hoped for immediate vindication. "However," Judge Sterling added, her voice rising, "I am deeply concerned by the conduct witnessed in this courtroom today, specifically, Officer Miller's repeated disruptions. This is unacceptable." Her eyes narrowed. "Furthermore, I find Ms. Albright's tone and certain accusations toward Ms. Jones to be unprofessional. This court does not tolerate bullying." Ms. Albright's smug expression faltered. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Tiffany felt a small flicker of satisfaction. At least the judge had seen through their theatrics. "Therefore," Judge Sterling declared, her voice resonating with authority, "I am holding both Officer Miller and Ms. Albright in contempt of court." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Officer Miller, who had been leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed, suddenly straightened, his face contorting in a mixture of shock and fury. Ms. Albright's jaw dropped. "What?" Miller exploded, taking a step forward, his voice booming. "You can't do that, Your Honor. I was just observing." "Officer Miller," Judge Sterling warned, her voice rising, "I advise you to control yourself. You are in my courtroom." "Contempt of court?" Ms. Albright chimed in, equally incensed. "On what grounds, Your Honor? I was simply defending my client." "On the grounds of disrupting proceedings and unprofessional conduct," Judge Sterling stated calmly, but with steel in her voice. "Both of you will report to the clerk's office to receive your fines. And Officer Miller, you will leave this courtroom immediately." Miller's face was beet red. He clenched his fists, his eyes darting between the judge and Tiffany. It was clear he was not used to being challenged, especially not by a female judge, and certainly not in front of people he was presumably trying to impress. His gaze finally settled on Tiffany, a dark, simmering anger radiating from him. He clearly blamed her for his current predicament. "This is ridiculous," he spat, taking another step forward. "This whole case is a farce, and this woman," he gestured wildly at Tiffany, "is a liar." Judge Sterling's patience snapped. "That is enough, Officer Miller. If you do not exit this courtroom this instant, I will have you removed and your fine significantly increased." Miller, fuming, looked as if he was about to argue further, but the judge's tone left no room for debate. He stomped towards the exit, but as he passed Tiffany's table, he paused. His eyes, full of venom, met hers. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he hissed, barely audible above the low murmurs in the courtroom. "You think you can just come in here and cause trouble for honest people?" Tiffany, startled by his sudden proximity and the raw aggression in his voice, instinctively recoiled. "I'm just asking for what's fair," she said, her voice a little shaky, but firm. "Fair?" Miller sneered. "I'll show you fair." And that's when it happened. In a split second, before anyone could react, Officer Miller's open palm swung through the air, connecting with a sickening thwack against Tiffany's cheek. The sound, sharp and brutal, echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. The force of the blow snapped Tiffany's head to the side. A searing pain bloomed on her cheek, a hot flush of shock and disbelief. Her ears rang. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with the fallout of the contempt charges, was now utterly, terrifyingly still. Everyone was frozen, wide-eyed, staring at Officer Miller, then at Tiffany, who stood rooted to the spot, her hand instinctively rising to her throbbing cheek. Judge Sterling, from her bench, was ashen. "Officer Miller!" she roared, her voice shaking with outrage. "You are under arrest. Bailiff, seize him." But the bailiff, a burly man named Frank, was momentarily stunned, caught off guard by the audacity of the act. Miller, momentarily triumphant, a cruel smirk on his face, stood there, chest heaving, his gaze still fixed on Tiffany, as if challenging her to react. Tiffany, however, was past fear. The pain was real, but it was quickly overshadowed by a scorching, righteous fury. She had been insulted, dismissed, and now violently assaulted, all in the very place meant to uphold justice. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sudden, overwhelming rush of adrenaline and a burning need to reclaim her dignity. This wasn't just about the fabric anymore. It was about every slight, every injustice, every time someone had tried to silence her or put her in her place. Her eyes fell on the judge's bench. Judge Sterling, shocked by the assault, had half risen from her seat, her hand gripping the edge of the polished wood, her face a mask of disbelief. In that split second, a wild, audacious thought sparked in Tiffany's mind. She saw the open space, the empty seat, the gavel lying innocently on the stand. It was an impulse, a defiance born of humiliation and a sudden, desperate need to take control. With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, Tiffany lunged. Her hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the judge's bench, pulling herself forward. Her legs, stiff from shock, awkwardly propelled her over the barrier. She stumbled, but caught herself, landing with a thump in the high-backed, leather-bound chair. The seat was still warm from Judge Sterling. The gavel felt surprisingly heavy in her trembling hand. Silence descended once more, heavier and more profound than before. The entire courtroom, from the stunned bailiff to the aghast glamour-gowned lawyers, from the frozen jury to the open-mouthed spectators, stared. Officer Miller, his victorious smirk replaced by a look of utter bewilderment, stood motionless. Tiffany, her chest heaving, felt the sting in her cheek and the wild beat of her heart. She looked down at the gavel in her hand, then up at the sea of shocked faces. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. She was sitting in the judge's seat, a young black woman, just slapped by a cop, now holding the power of the court. What had she just done? The enormity of her actions, the sheer audacity, began to sink in. She had crossed a line, a very big line. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for her next move, waiting for something, anything, to break the surreal silence. It was a moment suspended in time, a cliffhanger of epic proportions. The story was far from over. The gavel felt strangely natural in Tiffany's hand, heavy and cool against her clammy palm. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, deafening silence. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on her, wide with disbelief, some with dawning horror, others with a peculiar flicker of awe. Officer Miller, who had been advancing towards her with a renewed snarl, froze mid-step, his jaw slack. Judge Sterling, still half out of her seat, stared, her face a mask of utter astonishment. The bailiff, Frank, finally stirred, reaching for his radio, his movements slow and clumsy as if navigating a dream. Tiffany's mind, usually so sharp and analytical, was a chaotic storm. One part of her screamed, "Get out! You're going to jail! What have you done?" Another, deeper part, a defiant spark ignited by the slap, felt an exhilarating surge of power. For once, she wasn't just a defendant, a plaintiff, or a victim. She was here, in the seat of authority, and for this fleeting, insane moment, she was in control. She looked at Officer Miller, who now stood utterly dumbfounded. His face, usually a canvas of aggressive confidence, was momentarily blank. The smirk was gone, replaced by a gaping incredulity. And in that instant, Tiffany found her voice, though it emerged as a shaky whisper. "Order in the court," she said, surprising even herself. The words were automatic, an echo of what she'd heard countless times. But when she said them, they seemed to carry a strange weight, bouncing off the high ceilings of the courtroom. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They simply stared. Then, Judge Sterling, finding her voice, let out a choked gasp. "Ms. Jones, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get out of that chair this instant." Her voice, usually so commanding, was laced with a desperate edge. Tiffany, however, kept her eyes on Miller. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice growing slightly steadier. "You just assaulted me, in a courtroom, in front of a judge. That is a crime." Miller finally found his voice, a spluttering, indignant roar. "You crazy woman, get out of that chair before I drag you out." He started to move towards the bench again, his hand reaching for his sidearm, not to draw it, but as an unconscious gesture of aggression. "Stop," Tiffany commanded, and to her own astonishment, the word rang out with a surprising authority. She instinctively slammed the gavel down. Thwack! The sound was sharp, resonant, and seemed to physically jolt everyone in the room. Miller froze again, a few feet from the bench. His hand fell away from his side. The unexpected force of her command, combined with the shock of her actions, had temporarily paralyzed him. "You will not approach this bench," Tiffany stated, her eyes locking with Miller's. "You will not threaten me. And you will not disrespect this court." She gestured around the room with her free hand. "This court, which, for the moment, I am presiding over." A ripple went through the spectators. A nervous cough from someone in the back. A barely audible whisper. Judge Sterling looked like she might collapse. Frank, the bailiff, had finally managed to get his radio to his mouth, but he hadn't yet spoken into it, his eyes still wide, fixed on Tiffany. "This is madness," Ms. Albright shrieked, finally snapping out of her stupor. "Your Honor, this is an outrage. She's committing a serious felony, impersonating a judge. Get her out of there." "Silence, counsel," Tiffany snapped, the gavel still gripped tightly. She realized, with a strange clarity, that she was drawing on every legal drama she'd ever watched, every moment of perceived injustice she'd ever witnessed. "You were just held in contempt. Perhaps another charge is in order." Ms. Albright recoiled, genuinely startled. The audacity, the sheer nerve of Tiffany's words, temporarily stunned her into silence. Tiffany turned her gaze to Judge Sterling. "Your Honor," she said, her voice softening slightly, but maintaining a firm edge. "With all due respect, Officer Miller assaulted me. You commanded the bailiff to arrest him." The bailiff hesitated. Justice in that moment was not served. "I merely stepped in to ensure that it would be." Judge Sterling, still leaning against her bench, closed her eyes for a moment, as if to ward off a nightmare. "Ms. Jones," she said, her voice strained, "your actions, while perhaps understandable given the provocation, are incredibly dangerous. You are making a terrible mistake. Please, for your own sake, step down." Tiffany shook her head. "I don't think so, Your Honor. Not yet. Not until I make sure Officer Miller faces the consequences of his actions. And perhaps, while I'm here, I can ensure this court hears the truth about glamour gowns." A bold, defiant glint appeared in her eyes. After all, someone needs to ensure justice is done. Just as Judge Sterling was about to speak again, the courtroom doors burst open. 2 more bailiffs, summoned by Frank's now active radio, rushed in, followed by a tall, stern-looking man in a sharp suit. He was Captain Davies, the head of courthouse security, known for his no-nonsense approach and strict adherence to protocol. His eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately swept the scene, registering the utterly bizarre tableau. Officer Miller, red-faced and furious, standing opposite a young black woman in the judge's chair, gavel in hand, while Judge Sterling stood beside her own bench, looking utterly bewildered. "What in the living hell is going on here?" Captain Davies boomed, his voice cutting through the tension. He spotted Miller. "Officer Miller, what is the meaning of this insubordination?" Miller, seizing on the arrival of backup, immediately pointed at Tiffany. "Captain, this woman assaulted me, then took the judge's seat. She's crazy." Tiffany, still in the judge's chair, raised an eyebrow. "I assaulted you, Officer Miller? You slapped me across the face in front of a full courtroom, and I assaulted you." Captain Davies, his eyes narrowed, looked at Judge Sterling. "Your Honor, is this true?" Judge Sterling, regaining some of her composure, nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on Tiffany with a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. "Captain Davies, Officer Miller did indeed assault Ms. Jones. And then Ms. Jones took my seat." Her voice trailed off, still unable to fully comprehend the situation. Davies's eyes went from Judge Sterling to Miller, then to Tiffany, lingering on the gavel in her hand. He was a man of logic and procedure, and this scene defied every single rule he knew. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice dangerously low, "stand down. Immediately." Miller hesitated, then, seeing the resolute expression on Davies's face, slowly backed away from the bench, his fury still simmering just beneath the surface. "Ms. Jones." Davies turned his attention to Tiffany, his voice now firm but not hostile. "I understand you feel wronged, but you cannot simply take over a courtroom. This is highly illegal. You need to step down. Now." Tiffany gripped the gavel tighter. "Captain Davies," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, "I am perfectly aware of the gravity of my actions, but Officer Miller's assault was not just an attack on me. It was an attack on the sanctity of this court. And frankly, the response was insufficient. Someone needed to ensure accountability. Until I am satisfied that justice will be served, I am staying right here." A ripple of murmurs went through the spectators. Some looked shocked, others strangely nodded. There was something undeniably compelling about Tiffany's defiance, about her refusal to be silenced. Davies stared at her for a long moment, processing. He was a veteran, he'd seen a lot of things, but never this. "Ms. Jones," he said, rubbing his temple, "you are talking yourself into a lot of trouble. I respect your conviction, but this is not how it works. You will be arrested for impersonating a judge, for obstruction of justice, and likely for contempt yourself. Please, step down." "And if I do," Tiffany challenged, "what guarantee do I have that Officer Miller will face justice for assaulting me? What guarantee do I have that my case against glamour gowns will be fairly judged, given the undue influence they seem to wield?" She gestured pointedly at Mr. Harrison and Ms. Albright, who were now huddled together, whispering furiously. "I came here for justice. I will not leave until I get it." The courtroom held its breath. It was an impossible standoff. A young woman against the entire legal system. Davies sighed, then looked at Judge Sterling. "Your Honor, I need your instructions." Judge Sterling, however, was still looking at Tiffany, a strange expression on her face. Her initial shock was slowly giving way to something else. A reluctant understanding, perhaps even a sliver of admiration for Tiffany's courage, however misguided. She knew the weight of what Tiffany was saying about the court's integrity. She had just held Miller in contempt herself, acknowledging his disruption. The slap had escalated everything into uncharted territory. "Captain Davies," Judge Sterling finally said, her voice regaining its strength, "I understand your position. However, there are extenuating circumstances. Officer Miller's actions were an egregious breach of conduct and an assault. I had indeed ordered his arrest." She paused, her gaze flicking to the stunned bailiff. "Frank. Bailiff Frank. Why was that order not immediately carried out? Frank, flustered, stammered. Your Honor, I was stunned, Your Honor. It happened so fast. I was reaching for my radio. Insufficient. Judge Sterling cut him off sharply. A direct order from the bench must be followed without hesitation. She then looked at Tiffany. Ms. Jones, while I cannot condone your actions, I acknowledge the frustration that led to them. However, your sitting in that chair is a violation of law and protocol. I will give you a direct order. Step down now, and I promise you, I will personally oversee the immediate arrest of Officer Miller. I will ensure that every charge against him for assault and contempt is vigorously pursued. And I will ensure your case against Glamour Gowns receives a fair and impartial review, possibly even by a different judge if you so request. It was a powerful offer. Tiffany hesitated, the gavel still heavy in her hand. This was her out, her chance to avoid serious legal repercussions and to ensure Miller faced justice. But there was still the lingering doubt, the feeling that she had to do more, that she had to make a point that couldn't be easily dismissed. And what about Glamour Gowns, Your Honor? Tiffany pressed. Their deceptive practices, their bullying. Will that be addressed with the same vigor? Judge Sterling looked at Ms. Albright and Mr. Harrison, her gaze now chillingly stern. Ms. Albright, Mr. Harrison, I assure you, your conduct and your company's practices will be scrutinized more closely than ever before. This incident has brought a harsh spotlight on everything that has transpired in this courtroom today. Ms. Albright and Mr. Harrison exchanged nervous glances. The tide was turning, and they knew it. Tiffany looked at the gavel again, then back at Judge Sterling. She could take the deal. It was a good deal, likely the best she was going to get. It secured justice for the assault and promised a fair hearing for her case. But something still gnawed at her. The sheer audacity of the moment, the surreal power she felt, was intoxicating. What if she could do more? What if she could, in this insane moment, make a statement that would reverberate far beyond this courtroom? She looked at Officer Miller, who was now being carefully watched by Captain Davies and the other bailiffs, his face still a mixture of rage and confusion. She saw the fear in Ms. Albright's eyes, the discomfort in Mr. Harrison's. She had rattled them. She had truly shaken the system. Your Honor, Tiffany said, her voice firm. I appreciate your offer. It is a generous one. However, I believe there's another way to ensure justice is truly served, and to send a message that cannot be ignored. Everyone in the courtroom leaned forward, utterly captivated. What was she planning? I propose, Tiffany continued, her eyes blazing with a newfound determination, that I remain in this seat under your supervision for a short period, not to rule but to oversee, to ensure transparency, to ensure that Officer Miller is indeed arrested and formally charged, to ensure that my case against Glamour Gowns is heard again, with a full and impartial panel, not just a single judge who might be swayed by hidden influences. She paused, taking a deep breath. And in return, I will step down peacefully without further incident, once these conditions are met to my satisfaction. A stunned silence followed her proposal. It was outrageous, unprecedented, and utterly audacious. Captain Davies looked like he was about to explode. Ms. Albright looked apoplectic. But Judge Sterling looked at Tiffany with an expression that was no longer just shock or anger, but a profound, almost bewildered, respect. She saw the fire, the conviction, the raw demand for justice in Tiffany's eyes, and perhaps a part of her, the part that believed in the true spirit of the law, understood. The courtroom had been disrupted, but Tiffany, in her own wild way, was trying to bring a different kind of order to it. Ms. Jones, Judge Sterling said slowly, her voice thoughtful, what you are proposing is impossible. It defies every legal precedent, every rule of this court. Does it, Your Honor? Tiffany challenged gently. Or does it simply defy convention? Officer Miller defied convention when he assaulted me. You defied convention when you held him in contempt. Perhaps, sometimes, convention needs to be defied to truly serve justice. Judge Sterling closed her eyes again, weighing the situation. She had a choice. She could have Tiffany forcibly removed, leading to a chaotic scene and a public scandal that would engulf the courthouse. Tiffany would face serious charges, and while Miller would undoubtedly be arrested, the narrative would be muddled. Or, she could consider this unthinkable, audacious proposal. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. But it was also a way to de-escalate, to control the narrative and, perhaps, to send a powerful message about accountability that would resonate far beyond this single case. Her eyes snapped open. She looked at Captain Davies, who was practically vibrating with indignation. She looked at the stunned faces of the jurors, the whispering spectators. And she looked at Tiffany, still sitting in her chair, gavel held firm, a quiet, resolute power radiating from her. "Captain Davies," Judge Sterling said, her voice clear and strong, "I want Officer Miller immediately removed from this courtroom and taken into custody. He is to be formally charged with assault and contempt of court. And Ms. Albright, you will also report to the clerk's office for your contempt fine. Failure to comply will result in further charges." Davies, though still seething, recognized the authority in Judge Sterling's voice. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, and with a gesture, the two additional bailiffs moved towards Officer Miller, who finally, after a moment of furious resistance, was led out of the courtroom, still muttering threats under his breath. "Now," Judge Sterling turned back to Tiffany, her gaze piercing, "Ms. Jones, your proposal is unprecedented and highly irregular, but I will consider a modified version of it." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Even Tiffany looked surprised. "You will remain in that chair," Judge Sterling continued, her voice gaining a strategic edge, "but under my strict supervision. You will not issue rulings or interfere directly with any court proceedings. However, you will act as a special observer, a representative of the public's demand for accountability. You will ensure that Officer Miller's arrest and charges are processed transparently. And you will be present during the rehearing of your case against Glamour Gowns, which I will personally fast-track, and assign to a panel of 3 judges for review, given the highly unusual circumstances." Ms. Albright looked ready to protest, but Judge Sterling silenced her with a stern look. In return, Judge Sterling concluded, her eyes locking with Tiffany's, "You will then immediately and peacefully vacate my seat, and all charges related to your present actions, including impersonating a judge, will be dropped. This is my final offer, Ms. Jones. Do you accept?" Tiffany looked at the gavel in her hand. The power was still there, but now it was tempered with a path forward, a chance for real, tangible justice. It was a risky move by the judge, an extraordinary concession, but it acknowledged the truth of Tiffany's desperate actions. She had pushed the system to its breaking point, and the system, surprisingly, had bent. A slow smile spread across Tiffany's face. She looked at Judge Sterling, a flicker of genuine respect in her eyes. "I accept, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." The courtroom buzzed, a cacophony of whispers and exclamations. It was an unprecedented agreement, a moment that would undoubtedly go down in courthouse history. Tiffany, the young black woman who had been slapped and then took the judge's seat, had not only secured justice for herself but had forced the system to bend to her will. But the implications of this decision, the reactions of those in power, and the fallout from this extraordinary defiance were only just beginning. The story of Tiffany Jones and her impossible seat on the bench had just entered a new, far more dangerous, and utterly unpredictable chapter. The immediate aftermath of Judge Sterling's astonishing concession was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Captain Davies, though still visibly bristling at the unorthodox arrangement, barked orders into his radio, ensuring Officer Miller's formal booking and the meticulous documentation of the assault. Ms. Albright, pale with a mixture of rage and fear, was escorted by another bailiff to the clerk's office to process her contempt fine, casting venomous glances at Tiffany as she left. Mr. Harrison, the representative for Glamour Gowns, looked utterly deflated, his earlier corporate swagger completely evaporated. Tiffany remained in the judge's chair, the gavel now resting gently on the stand beside her, a symbolic scepter of her temporary authority. Judge Sterling, though she had made the unprecedented decision, maintained a stern, watchful presence. She stood beside her own bench, observing Tiffany, ensuring the limits of their extraordinary agreement were immediately understood. "Ms. Jones," Judge Sterling stated, her voice firm, "you are now a special observer. Your role is to witness to ensure transparency. You are not to issue commands, question testimony, or interfere with the court's existing functions. Is that understood?" "Understood, Your Honor," Tiffany replied, her voice calm, a sense of relief mixing with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She felt the weight of her responsibility, but also a strange, quiet satisfaction. She had achieved something remarkable. The first test of their unusual arrangement came swiftly. A local news reporter, drawn by the commotion and the rumors of an incident in Courtroom 3B, managed to slip past the beefed-up security at the doors. Her eyes, sharp and hungry for a story, immediately zeroed in on Tiffany in the judge's chair. "Excuse me," the reporter called out, holding up a microphone. "What's happening here? Is it true a civilian has taken over the court?" Captain Davies immediately moved to block her, but Judge Sterling held up a hand. "Let her speak, Captain. Transparency, as Ms. Jones has so eloquently pointed out, is paramount." Tiffany met the reporter's gaze, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. This was her chance. "Yes," Tiffany said, her voice clear and resonant. "I am Tiffany Jones, and I am currently presiding as a special observer in this court. I was assaulted by Officer Miller, who has now been arrested. I am here to ensure justice is done, not just for myself, but for anyone who has felt unheard in this system." The reporter's eyes widened, sensing the magnitude of the scoop. She started firing questions, but Judge Sterling quickly intervened. "This is not a press conference," Judge Sterling stated, her voice regaining its full authority. "However, let it be known that Officer Miller has been arrested on charges of assault and contempt of court. The court is actively addressing this matter. Ms. Jones's case, Jones v. Glamour Gowns LLC, will be reheard by a special panel of 3 judges, expedited, and with Ms. Jones as an official observer. This unprecedented arrangement is in the interest of justice and public accountability." The reporter, scribbling furiously, looked back at Tiffany, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. Tiffany had become an instant icon, a symbol of defiance. Over the next few hours, the courthouse buzzed with the news. Lawyers paused in the hallways, whispering, looking towards Courtroom 3B with a mix of incredulity and intrigue. Other judges, initially outraged, were now curious, some even expressing a grudging respect for Judge Sterling's bold handling of an impossible situation. The story, fueled by the reporter's initial reports, was already spreading like wildfire on social media. #TiffanyTakesTheBench and #JusticeForTiffany were trending. Tiffany, from her vantage point, observed everything. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other small claims defendants, the tired resignation in the public defenders, the casual arrogance of some of the corporate lawyers. She realized that her presence, however temporary, was having an effect. People were speaking in hushed tones, but they were speaking. The air felt charged, crackling with a new energy. Her first official act as special observer came when she noticed a young man, a nervous-looking Latino immigrant named Mateo, trying to explain his case to an impatient clerk. Mateo, who spoke broken English, was clearly struggling to fill out a complex form, risking the dismissal of his own small claim for unpaid wages. The clerk, overwhelmed and seemingly annoyed, was about to send him away. Tiffany, remembering her own meticulous preparation and the difficulty she'd had navigating the system, felt a pang of empathy. She subtly caught Judge Sterling's eye. "Judge Sterling." "Bailiff," Judge Sterling commanded. "Please assist that young man with his paperwork. Ensure he understands the process completely. No one should be denied justice due to a language barrier or confusing bureaucracy." The clerk, startled, immediately changed her demeanor, and the bailiff politely went to Mateo's aid. Mateo looked up, his eyes meeting Tiffany's, and offered a small, grateful nod. It was a tiny victory, but it felt significant. Tiffany realized that even without issuing direct commands, her presence was influencing the court to be more empathetic. Later that afternoon, the three-judge panel for Tiffany's reheard case was assembled. It consisted of Judge Sterling herself, a younger, sharp-witted black judge named Judge Anya Sharma, and a grizzled, experienced white judge named Judge Thomas O'Connell. The atmosphere was different this time. Ms. Albright and Mr. Harrison, though still present, were far more subdued. Ms. Albright, having paid her contempt fine, looked chastened. Their usual confident swagger had been replaced by nervous glances towards Tiffany. Still seated in the main judge's chair, her expression unreadable. The proceedings began, and Tiffany, listening from her unique vantage point, noticed details she might have missed before. The subtle ways Ms. Albright tried to obfuscate the slight misrepresentations of fact. She made no sound, no gesture, but her very presence, her silent scrutiny, seemed to put the Glamour Gowns team on edge. Judge Sharma, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation and the public eye now on the case, was particularly sharp, dissecting Ms. Albright's arguments with incisive questions. Judge O'Connell, initially skeptical of the entire arrangement, seemed to warm to Tiffany's quiet dignity, occasionally glancing at her with a thoughtful expression. During a particularly frustrating exchange where Ms. Albright tried to argue that the term organic silk was merely aspirational marketing, Tiffany caught Judge Sterling's eye. Judge Sterling, in turn, fixed Ms. Albright with a piercing stare. "Counselor," Judge Sterling stated, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "are you suggesting that your company believes it is acceptable to describe a product as organic silk from Italy, when it is, in fact, a synthetic blend from an undisclosed source, and then dismiss a consumer's legitimate complaint as amateurish? Are you suggesting the court should condone such aspirational marketing as truthful and ethical?" Ms. Albright stammered, clearly cornered. "Your Honor, we believe the product quality is high regardless of the precise truth?" Judge O'Connell interjected, his voice surprisingly firm. "Counselor, in this court, truth matters. And Ms. Jones's evidence, including samples and customer testimonials, paints a very different picture of your truth." Tiffany felt a surge of satisfaction. Her presence, her silent witness, was undeniably affecting the dynamic. The judges were not just hearing the case. They were feeling the weight of public expectation, the demand for genuine justice. The case continued for several more hours, delving deeper into the contractual agreements, the specific wording of Glamour Gowns advertisements, and the actual chemical composition of the fabric. Tiffany, using her keen eye for detail, mentally noted every inconsistency, every moment where Ms. Albright stretched the truth. She knew that her being there, observing, made it harder for the defense to get away with the usual legalistic evasions. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ornate courtroom, the panel announced a brief recess for deliberation. Judge Sterling turned to Tiffany. "Ms. Jones," she said, a hint of something unreadable in her eyes, "you have conducted yourself with remarkable decorum given the circumstances. Your presence has been instructive." Tiffany offered a small smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. I believe accountability benefits everyone." During the deliberation, which took place behind closed doors, a buzz of anticipation filled the courtroom. The news of the observer judge and the rehearing had drawn an even larger crowd of spectators and media. Maria, Tiffany's best friend, finally managed to push her way through the throng, her eyes wide with concern and pride. "Tiff, are you crazy?" Maria whispered fiercely as she reached the railing. "You actually did it. You took the judge's seat. Everyone's talking about it. It was an impulse," Tiffany admitted, a wry smile touching her lips. "But it worked. Look around, Maria. They're actually listening this time." "They better be," Maria said, looking at Tiffany with fierce admiration. "You've risked everything for this. But what happens next, Tiff? What happens when this is over?" Tiffany's gaze drifted to the now empty defendant's table where Officer Miller had stood. She knew that her stand, while effective in this immediate moment, would have far-reaching consequences. Her life would never be the same. The legal world, the media, perhaps even her own community would be watching. The deliberation lasted longer than expected, stretching into the evening. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Finally, the three judges re-entered, their faces grave. Everyone rose. Judge Sterling cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Tiffany. After careful and extensive deliberation, she began, her voice slow and deliberate. The panel has reached a decision in the case of Tiffany Jones versus Glamour Gowns LLC. Tiffany's heart pounded. This was it, the culmination of her daring gamble. It is the unanimous decision of this panel, Judge Sterling announced, her voice resonating, that Glamour Gowns LLC engaged in deceptive advertising and fraudulent business practices. Their claims regarding the organic Italian silk were found to be materially false, and their dismissive and hostile treatment of Ms. Jones's legitimate complaint further demonstrates a pattern of unethical conduct. A ripple of gasps and murmurs went through the courtroom. Mr. Harrison looked like he'd been punched. Ms. Albright's jaw dropped. Therefore, Judge Sterling continued, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Ms. Tiffany Jones. Glamour Gowns LLC is ordered to immediately pay Ms. Jones the full requested amount of $2,500, plus an additional $7,500 in punitive damages for their fraudulent and unprofessional conduct, bringing the total award to $10,000. A collective roar erupted from the spectators, quickly stifled by the bailiffs. Tiffany felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. $10,000. It was more than she had ever hoped for. More than just money, it was vindication. It was justice. Furthermore, Judge Sterling added, raising her voice above the murmurs, this court will be forwarding its findings to the appropriate consumer protection agencies and the State Attorney General's office for a full investigation into Glamour Gowns LLC's business practices. This court does not tolerate fraud or the exploitation of honest consumers and small businesses. Mr. Harrison and Ms. Albright looked utterly devastated. Their company's reputation, already tarnished, was now in tatters, facing a full government investigation. Tiffany, from her temporary seat of power, watched their defeat and felt not triumph, but a quiet satisfaction that truth had prevailed. Now, Judge Sterling concluded, her gaze once again on Tiffany, her voice softening slightly, Ms. Jones, you have fulfilled your role as a special observer. The court has rendered its judgment in your favor, and Officer Miller is currently being processed for his arrest and charges. Your conditions have been met. She then looked at the gavel beside Tiffany. It is time for you to step down. Tiffany slowly reached for the gavel, picking it up one last time. She looked around the courtroom, at the relieved faces of the spectators, at Maria beaming with pride, at the solemn faces of the judges. She had done it. She had pushed the boundaries, taken an outrageous risk, and emerged victorious. She then, with a deliberate motion, placed the gavel back on the stand. Taking a deep breath, she slowly rose from the judge's chair. The chair felt oddly empty without her. She looked at Judge Sterling, a genuine smile on her face. Thank you, Your Honor, Tiffany said, her voice filled with sincerity, for your courage and for ensuring justice was truly served today. Judge Sterling nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. Thank you, Ms. Jones, she replied, for reminding us all of the power of conviction and the importance of holding this court and ourselves to the highest standards of justice. As Tiffany stepped down from the bench, her feet touching the marble floor again, she felt a profound sense of closure. The extraordinary journey she had taken, from a simple plaintiff to a temporary guardian of justice, was complete. But as she walked towards Maria, past the murmuring crowds and the flashing cameras, she knew this wasn't truly the end. It was merely the end of this chapter. Her life had irrevocably changed. The woman who had been slapped in court and then taken the judge's seat was no longer just a fashion designer. She was a force, and the world, she suspected, was about to find out just what that truly meant. The next chapter, though yet unwritten, promised to be just as impactful, just as unpredictable, and just as deeply rooted in her unwavering fight for truth and justice. The moment Tiffany's feet touched the marble floor, a cacophony erupted. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrusting towards her like a forest of metallic weeds. Flashbulbs popped, blinding her momentarily. Maria, fierce and protective, immediately wrapped an arm around Tiffany, trying to shield her from the onslaught. Judge Sterling, with a sharp crack of her own gavel, ordered the courtroom cleared, but the image of Tiffany, bathed in the media's relentless glare, was already seared into the collective consciousness. As Tiffany and Maria navigated the chaotic exit, a sense of unreality settled over her. The sting on her cheek had faded, replaced by the ghost of 1,000 eyes, 1,000 questions. She was no longer just Tiffany Jones, the ambitious fashion designer from Brooklyn. She was the gavel girl, the people's judge, the woman who had dared to challenge the system and won. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, talk shows, and incessant media attention. Her story, a potent blend of racial injustice, corporate malfeasance, and individual defiance, resonated deeply across the country. Local news stations quickly became national, then international. Tiffany found herself on morning shows, cable news panels, and even featured in prominent magazines. Each time, she spoke with a quiet dignity, recounting the slap, her audacious act, and her unwavering belief in justice. She never sensationalized, never played the victim, but consistently returned to the core message: accountability for all, regardless of power or position. Officer Miller was formally charged. His assault on Tiffany, witnessed by a courtroom full of people and now a public spectacle, left no room for doubt. The video footage, pieced together from courtroom security cameras and a brave citizen journalist's phone, played endlessly on news cycles. He was suspended without pay, facing a criminal trial and internal affairs investigations that promised to end his career. Ms. Albright and Mr. Harrison, and by extension Glamour Gowns LLC, faced their own reckoning. The Attorney General's investigation quickly revealed a pattern of deceptive practices, leading to massive fines and class action lawsuits from disgruntled customers across the nation. Glamour Gowns' once shining reputation crumbled, its stock plummeted, and the company eventually filed for bankruptcy. Amidst the media storm, Tiffany's small business, Threads of Truth, blossomed. Orders poured in, not just for her unique, sustainable designs, but from people who admired her courage and wanted to support her. The $10,000 settlement was a welcome boost, allowing her to expand her workshop, hire 2 assistants, and invest in higher quality, genuinely organic materials. She even designed a special Justice collection, featuring elegant pieces in deep blues and silvers, each garment carrying a small, embroidered gavel motif. It sold out instantly, but with newfound fame came new challenges. Not everyone saw Tiffany as a hero. Some criticized her actions as reckless, an affront to the rule of law. Online trolls, hiding behind anonymous screens, sent her hate mail and threats. There were whispers in certain legal circles that Judge Sterling had acted improperly, setting a dangerous precedent. Yet, for every detractor there were 10 more supporters. Letters of encouragement flooded her mailbox, many from people who felt similarly marginalized and unheard, seeing in Tiffany a champion for their own silent struggles. One such letter came from a prestigious civil rights organization, inviting Tiffany to speak at their annual convention. She accepted. Her speech, delivered to a standing ovation, wasn't just about her personal experience. It was a powerful call to action, urging ordinary citizens to demand transparency, accountability, and fairness from all institutions. "I sat in that judge's seat not because I wanted to be a judge," Tiffany told the packed auditorium, her voice ringing with conviction, "but because in that moment, justice itself felt absent. I realized then that the seat of justice doesn't just belong to the robed figures. It belongs to all of us. It belongs to anyone willing to stand up, speak truth to power, and demand what is right." Her words resonated deeply. After the convention, Tiffany was approached by a group of legal advocates and community organizers. They had an idea: the People's Justice Initiative. It would be a non-profit organization, co-founded by Tiffany, dedicated to empowering individuals to navigate the legal system, offering free legal aid workshops, and advocating for systemic reforms to make justice more accessible and equitable for everyone. Tiffany hesitated. Her passion was fashion, her business was thriving. Could she really commit to something so vast, so demanding? But then she remembered the look on Mateo's face, the fear in the eyes of other plaintiffs, the casual indifference of the powerful. She remembered the slap, the heat of rage, and the astonishing feeling of power when she'd seized that gavel. She remembered the promise she'd made to herself, to ensure justice was truly served. "Yes," Tiffany told them, her eyes bright with renewed purpose. "I'm in." The People's Justice Initiative quickly gained traction, leveraging Tiffany's fame and her unwavering commitment. She divided her time, managing threads of truth, with the help of her expanding team, and dedicating herself to the initiative. She spoke at community centers, mentored young activists, and even advised local politicians on legal reform. Her life had taken an unforeseen turn, intertwining her creative passion with a powerful new calling for social change. 1 year later, Officer Miller was convicted of assault and contempt of court. He was sentenced to a year in prison and permanently barred from law enforcement. The conviction was hailed as a landmark victory for accountability. Glamour Gowns, now a cautionary tale, was a shell of its former self, its brand synonymous with deceit. Tiffany, now a recognized figure in both the fashion world and the legal advocacy space, sat in her bustling threads of Truth Studio, sketching new designs. Maria, now a fully certified paralegal and the People's Justice Initiative's first full-time employee, walked in, a stack of files in her arms. "Another successful workshop last night, Tiff," Maria said, beaming. "3 more families got their small claims filed, and we even helped an elderly woman overturn a wrongful eviction notice." Tiffany smiled, a genuine, content smile. Her cheek no longer bore the physical mark of the slap, but the memory served as a constant reminder of her journey. "That's fantastic, Maria," Tiffany replied, putting down her pencil. "Every small victory makes a difference." She picked up a small silver gavel, a gift from Judge Sterling, who had become a quiet mentor. The judge, whose career had initially faced scrutiny for her unconventional decision, was now widely lauded for her courage and foresight. She had even privately admitted to Tiffany that she had never truly expected her to step down, but was relieved and impressed by her integrity. Tiffany held the gavel in her hand. It was no longer a symbol of outrage or impulsive defiance, but of hope. She had taken a seat she was never meant to occupy, not to wield power for herself, but to amplify the voices of the unheard. She had transformed a moment of profound injustice into a movement for change. Her story, "Cops slapped a black woman in court, seconds later, she took the judge's seat," was no longer just a sensational headline. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, the quietest voices can thunder, the most ordinary individuals can ignite extraordinary change, and true justice, however unconventional its path, will ultimately prevail. Tiffany Jones, the fashion designer who became an accidental justice warrior, knew her fight was far from over. But she also knew that she was no longer fighting alone. She had found her true calling, a purpose as intricately woven and beautifully designed as any of her garments, to thread truth and justice into the very fabric of society. Comment for more.